Ministry of Future Affairs is a series of peer-to-peer interviews organized by Armenia 2041 Foundation and conducted by well-known Armenians and non-Armenians from around the world. The series covers a wide range of topics, including science, education, healthcare, politics, business, and focuses on themes relevant to Armenia and the diaspora. Watch every week on Armenia 2041 and CivilNet platforms.
Eric, welcome. It's a great pleasure to be able to talk to you today.
Thank you. My pleasure.
So let me start out pointing out to our audience that you wear many, many hats. You're a doctor, you have a very high position in a major university, you're a philanthropist, you're an entrepreneur, and you're an ardent supporter of many Armenian causes. How do you do all of that at the same time?
Well, I mean, it's a great question, and I think about that myself quite a bit, but you know, I think it's just been a part of an evolution of who I am. I feel like every day, you know, first of all, to your point about supporting Armenian causes or being Armenian, it's part of me, you know, and I'm proud that it's a part of me. And you know, even though I was born in this country, when my father was going to school, we soon after that left the country, and so I really came back essentially as an immigrant and a refugee, really, when my parents were born in Iran. And so I have always felt very close to the Armenian roots that we all have. And it's been a part of my daily life, essentially, throughout my life, even though we lived a fairly assimilated life when I was growing up. Mm-hmm. So all along that way, I've been a witness to hard work and determination and value of education. So that was instilled in me as a young child. And so each milestone that I've kind of reached, I've never felt that that's a time to kind of celebrate. It's just something to kind of nod and move on from. So I've incorporated all these things in my life on a daily basis, and I never feel like I'm sacrificing one for the other. You know, I mean, to your point about being trained as a physician, you know, that's something I always wanted to do, and I always had a dream of helping people by being a physician. But when I started studying medicine, I also learned about public health, and I realized when I was doing my master's in public health how I could potentially have an effect over a population and a community. And now that's been more relevant than ever, as you know, because of the pandemic and the impact of the field of public health on society. And during that process, I also, you know, when I was in college, I was an English minor. Actually, I was an English major until my parents basically said to me, "Why are you studying English? I thought you spoke English." You know, so it was a hard conversation for an immigrant family to say, "Well, I'm studying literature. It's not English as a second language." But so storytelling was always a part of what I wanted to do in addition to studying science and being a physician. So in my day-to-day, I try to incorporate all of those things together. And then also at UCLA, I did a one-year business school program, which really opened my eyes to the potential of leveraging the impact of whatever work I do through entrepreneurship. And so, you know, on a day-to-day basis now, I just kind of figure out different ways to utilize those different skill sets, and I'm still learning, you know, I'm still evolving. Yeah.
And I should have said, I should have added another thing that you do quite a bit these days, which is making films.
Right.
And that is probably as different than being a physician or many of the other things. So I guess in that regard, including the filmmaking part, do you find yourself being the same person in each of those roles? Or do you feel that they are all separate roles, even if they influence each other?
Well, I definitely feel like they're complementary. So when we were making The Promise, for example, which was a very large production and with a very specific intent. You know, the intent of that film was to get the United States government to recognize the Armenian genocide. So from a scientific and medical background, I always, you know, really tried to work backwards from what the end goal was, which is a little bit different, I think, than a traditional filmmaking process where, especially if there's any financial motivation and, you know, this is how you make a living, I think a lot of people have to approach filmmaking differently. We viewed the storytelling as an adjunct to a mission and a tool, essentially. And that's why when we made The Promise and Intent to Destroy simultaneously, people are like, well, why do you have a documentary going in parallel with a feature film? It's like, well, a feature film, you can only take you so far. The documentary is when you're really going to dig into the facts. And after decades of not being able to convince legislators, the Senate, House, President of our plight, so to speak, and our truth, you needed to utilize that. So as a physician and administrator, I had learned all these skills that enabled me to tell the story better, or at least to get the effective result, which we did. And I think that for me also, and you know this as a scientist, the storytelling can completely change the impression or the reach of the science, right? So like during the pandemic, for example, we have issues with people understanding vaccine, or they have vaccine hesitancy. How can we, are we going to show them papers from like Cell and Nature and say, no, look, here, read this paper? No, we're not. We're going to get testimonials from people they trust. We're going to kind of show them facts and embed those facts into the shows that they watch, and maybe have commercials, or maybe even make films, So I think that storytelling and public health and advocacy for human rights, these are all now blending together. And I think it's actually a good thing. It just so happens I'm crossing all these domains simultaneously.
Yeah. And it's interesting observation that your immigrant past, your refugee past, and you're realizing, as I've done over the last few years, just how much it defines us. And one of the ways I'd say it could define us, and I'm curious to your experience, is that if you're born and grow up in a safe place and you never think about leaving, you ask yourself the question, what do you want to be, or what do I want to be?
Right.
And it's this or that or that. But as an immigrant, you kind of end up having to be this and that and that and that, because you have to change countries,
right,
learn new languages. So to what extent is this ability, you think, to integrate so many different things that you feel you have to be good at, the result of that immigrant experience?
First of all, coming from a family that values and appreciates the opportunities that we have in this country has really set the tone, I think, for me in my life on a day-to-day basis. And I start each day with gratitude, thinking about that. I pray, and in the morning I thank God. Every morning, first thing I do when I wake up, as I focus on gratitude, and being the great-grandchild of Armenian genocide survivors too, I also feel like, wow, the story of my great-grandparents meeting and surviving and basically escaping Turkey and going to Iraq and then moving to Iran, is the odds of them surviving are so infinitesimally small that I think about the odds of myself being here. It's basically, I'm not supposed to be here. So every day I wake up and I think that that's a blessing. And I try to instill that into my own children and to tell them about their great-great-grandparents. And I think, for them, it's a different reality. They don't have the same reality that we've had. So it doesn't mean they should feel guilty about it, but it also means that they should view it as a blessing and be appreciative of the opportunities. And that's one of the reasons why I think as immigrants or refugees, we do constantly try to evolve. I mean, this, if you talk to any of your Armenian friends who've had parents who have moved here as well, you see all the different jobs that they've done.
Right.
So many people, if you read, you're looking at a resume for someone who's come from another country. They could have been a physician, and here they're doing a different job, or they've come here and they've done 5 different tasks. Right. It also tells you about their willingness to do a job, which is, for young people these days, it's a hard thing to understand that, some people are willing to do anything just to get their foot in the door.
Right, and of course, that's the other thing you realize in an immigrant experience, is that fear is a luxury.
Right.
Being afraid that you can't do the job is something that locals kind of really think a lot about.
Yeah.
But if you don't have a choice, you'll do it, and then you find out you can even do it. So,
like my father would say, it still says to me all the time, or hatsutenk, like how are you going to put food on the table, and so that is something that it resonates with me, especially as I talk to my own kids about what they want to study in the future and what they're doing. It's like, how are you going to eat?
No, it's interesting. So I'm going to move to the second set of questions, but I think the interesting kind of thing about all this is that, in a way, to hear you describe it, if you're come from a past that has experienced genocide in your ancestry, in a way, you stay an immigrant for a long time,
Right.
because you feel like you're kind of are living off of a second chance at life.
Yes.
Like you said, you don't deserve to be here. And keeping that notion going generationally kind of keeps the good part of being an immigrant or not settling.
Yes.
It's this notion of like, how settled do you want your kids to be?
Yes.
And while in fact the dream of a lot of people who came to this country 100 years ago was to kind of shed their responsibility and this historic burden they had,
Yeah.
actually the people who have continued to keep the dream going are people who never shed that, because
Right.
it made them different, it made them motivated to do stuff, and those are the ones that did better.
Right. I mean, I remember one time, you know, I was going through the process of, you know, trying to get this recognition and dealing with politicians and, you know, people who are the advocates of politicians, kind of saying, you know, like, this is our story, and we're not making this up, and here are the facts, et cetera. And somebody once said to me, "When are you going to let this go?" I said, "Never." Yeah. So you can recognize it, but I'm still not letting it go.
Exactly.
So,
that's just one
yeah.
step. Well, look, first, congratulations, because I know that genocide recognition has been the work of a lot of people. And when it happened, you know, lots of people claim credits for it. Before that, it was, you know, the government's fault or whatever. So, so now we can all kind of celebrate it.
Yes.
But on that front, I want to kind of take us to perhaps a bit more of a difficult topic, and that is, I'd love to know how you're thinking about it. You know, in the almost 60 years I've been alive, initially in Lebanon, now in North America, I can't remember a time where I felt the conditions were going back to where we were 100 years ago, in terms of vulnerability, in terms of not knowing who to count on, who our allies are, and really existential threats. And here we are kind of talking about overcoming the denial of a genocide, but the conditions at the same time on the ground, whether it's in Artsakh or even in Armenia, in terms of trying to figure out how to survive in that fairly hostile neighborhood, have seemed to have gone back to where it was in, you know, pre-World War I.
Yeah.
And similarly, at least what worries me a bit is that, or more and more, is that probably back then we also were counting on the wrong people to do things for us, and we realized we have to do it ourselves. So how are you thinking these days about kind of it's always hard to say existential threats, because once you've gone through a genocide, everything is an existential threat. I mean, look at the Jews, they face this every day. But how do you think about that in these particularly troubled times?
Well, I try to, again, I have hope because, and I think that hope comes from our faith. And I think if you look back at history, of course, we focus a lot on the last 100 years. Kind of modern times dominate our thought processes these days, right? So we're focused on the news, and we use technology, and we look at the things that we could see, video, et cetera. But if we think about the history of Armenia and the history of the region, you know, empires have risen and fallen and crumbled, and Armenia has been attacked and invaded for centuries. Yet it still stands. So I kind of view this as a chapter in a very, very long book, you know, and it's during our lifetime. So I do think all of us who have some leverage or some ability or some position of authority or resources throughout the world, you know, we will have to think about how do we deploy those resources, how do we use that influence, you know, what are the pressure points that we can all employ separately or collectively. But you know, I try not to get too discouraged. Of course, there are disappointments along the way, but in terms of discouragement, like when I hear people say, "Oh, Armenia's gone forever," or "Armenia's lost," you know, I disagree. You know, and if you even look at Khorvirab, for example, where you know the patron saint of our church, Saint Gregory the Illuminator, was in the pit for 13 years. If you look at it, how is that even still there? You know, how has in an earthquake zone, how has that not crumbled into the ground over thousands of years? You know, our cathedral in Echmiadzin, built in 303 AD. If you look at it, how has that not fallen into the ground? All these, you know, centuries, when everything else, you know, you build a house in Los Angeles 5 years ago, and it rains for 2 minutes, and you have the water intrusion, right? How is that cathedral still standing? So I, you know, not to make this overly religious, but I do have faith, and I do believe that, you know, it plays a role in terms of my hope for not getting discouraged.
No, it's a great way to put it. I will say this. in any event, when you painted the picture of Khorbirab, I think the second miracle was when I went down the first time and fit through that hole to go down. Most people were thinking this is going to be a disaster. So the fact that I could go down and experience what he felt was a personal miracle to me. But you know, the thing that's interesting, what you're saying about the kind of our faith. Of course, the tricky part about our faith, so I understand personally that this is what's keeping you. But the question is how not to make our faith think that some other form of intervention is going to save us. And of course, the question is, how does our faith give us the optimism and the positivity to do something about it? And the question is, if it's not now, then when? Right? I mean, it can't, like a lot of times I find Armenians kind of will say, well, this is not the right time, or what can we do about it? The answer is that the clouds are gathered enough that if we say it's somebody else's problem, that becomes problematic. So I agree with the optimism and the reason to believe we can make it through this, but at the same time, it's probably going to be on our watch.
Yeah, and I think in terms of that, when I talk about our faith, it's not necessarily that we just have to pray about it. You know, I disagree with that. It's basically we individually may have success, and then what do we do with that success? You know, when we're in a room with somebody who actually has a decision-making ability, do we use that opportunity to advocate for Armenia or Artsakh or whatnot, you know, or to establish, you know, all the different entrepreneurial pathways that you've been setting up and enabling, you know, young people in the country to build themselves up, new industries to come into the country. You know, I think that you've been a manifestation of that. You've been doing that for years, you know. So I think it's not about just praying for things to get better, but you've put yourself in a situation where you can actually do something. And if you think about if everybody does that, it makes a big difference. I do think, you know, there are moments where, you know, sometimes it's just not publicized. You know, I think that one of the problems in our society right now is there's an expectation that every single major decision is going to be on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, you know, and I say that, you know, when I do something like that, it's only when I want somebody to know what I'm doing, you know. You know, in terms of like real, serious geopolitical conversations, I will never put anything. I would never put anything into the public sphere.
No. I take from what you just said also before was that, you know, being discouraged is also a luxury.
Yes.
Right. I mean, we're too much on the path back to allow ourselves to get discouraged. Is what I hear from you. So maybe to stay on the general theme then of what's happening in Armenia and broadly in our nation, you know, if you look back over the last 30 years, I would contend that despite a lot of efforts and some successes, that the mechanisms for how the diaspora in Armenia could work together towards a common goal of achieving security and prosperity for Armenia and for all Armenians hasn't really materialized. And it's not because we're hard to satisfy. Objectively, there seems to be a lot of our networks, our resources, our influence, as you're saying it, that go unused. Now, some of it is because people don't want to expose themselves to, if on the outside, to this. But even if people do, and there are tons of people who do, it's just really, really hard to feel like there's an actual mechanism. What are your thoughts about kind of the next 30 years and how we could truly employ the position that the diaspora gives us towards the aims of the nation at large?
Well, I think the diaspora is an incredible asset to the global Armenian nation. You know, I think that very few countries or groups of people with such a small population have such a notable diaspora as the Armenians do. You know, and we're fortunate to have that and to be a part of it. I think, again, it's a blessing. It's also a responsibility. What do we do with that? How do we help Armenia? I think sometimes there's a disconnect just because once you've left the country, you end up, or you know, your ancestors left the country, you end up really, again, that survivor mechanism, you assimilate, you try to survive, you are doing whatever you can to make a home or a life in the country that you're living in. But we're connected to Armenia in so many different ways, and I think we have to think of ways for collaboration. Again, it's, you know, one of the things that I think you've pointed out is that sometimes there's a disconnect or there's divisions within the community. I think it's unrealistic for us to be completely lockstep all the time, because no groups of people are really like that. If you look at other diasporas, whether it's Jews or other groups of people, I don't think you could say, well, we all feel this way, you know. You saw it in the news cycles a few months ago where there were issues with Israel and Palestine, and American Jews had differing viewpoints on how the United States should be involved, or you know, what the role of Israel was in the government, et cetera. So I think, you know, you can look at the Jewish population and say, you know, that's analogous in many ways. You know, they've also suffered genocide. They've been persecuted for centuries, but you know, somehow the state of Israel has been thriving in many ways despite it. So there are lessons, I think, that we could also learn. But I think one thing for us in the United States is thinking about, again, I mean, my strategy is always do the best you can as an individual, and then try to build alliances and partnerships and see if you can somehow help benefit the country.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And related to that, then the question is what happens with Armenia, of course, affects what happens to Armenians all around the world, yeah. Especially if we're going to derive more and more of the source of Armenianness from having a homeland, which right. Historically we have had you know, little interaction with for periods of time. So in that regard, we're at a historic time in the sense that there are attempts, obviously, at various processes to try to settle the conflicts that exist in the region, and the government, you know, of Armenia has understandably the primary role in trying to see what can be accomplished, and of course there's a dilemma there, because while the country of Armenia and its government has to decide what to do in the present, what's done in the present inexorably affects what happens in the future, on the one hand, but also what happens to the whole nation outside the country.
Right.
Have you thought about, or are there ways we could be thinking about how to not necessarily participate in the decision, because that's not practical, mm-hmm. but how to provide some level of a sense from across the nation, across the world, that can ensure that what we do today provides for what we want to become in the future. Your idea before was, you know, as a physician, you think about where do I want to end up, and then you do things to that end. How do you think about that as it relates to our destiny together?
Yeah, well, I think one thing that maybe we haven't done well enough as a community, and myself included, is think strategically about where we want to be. You know, I think that, for example, governments will change. And I think, you know, in sports, being at UCLA and reading a lot about John Wooden, who is an inspiration, and he was a legendary basketball coach, he kind of embodied the notion of play for the name on the front of the jersey, not the name on the back of the jersey. So I think about that a lot at UCLA. You know, I'm involved as an administrator now and thinking about, you know, kind of the next 10 years and the campaign that we're going to have for university. And the things that I want to do there are meant to be there forever, you know, long after I'm gone. And we have to have that kind of approach, I think, for Armenia too. So politicians, you know, in every country are going to come and go. Political parties, same thing. So I know exactly what you're saying in terms of we have to like take the right steps, and what they're doing right now may affect how Armenia or Armenians live many generations down the road. But us, on the outside, with our skill sets that we may have, we should think about, like as you've been doing, for example, thinking about what are the technologies, what are the areas, what are the industries that need to exist in Armenia, whether it is in its current state or is it a different state a few years from now, based on political decisions, right? We know there has to be education. We know that the fields that are going to be important in the world that can also be relevant to Armenia need to somehow get started in Armenia. You know, there's a famous, I think it's a Chinese expression that somebody told me once, that said the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. So we really need to kind of get things going there. You know, there always needs to be education. Are we having the most, you know, kind of innovative educational leaders consulting on how to lead an education system in Armenia? I don't know if that's the case, but I'm trying to get, because I have access to those people who have, you know, kind of not just in an ivory tower, but who have practically been involved in launching education systems around the world. I want to get those people engaged in Armenia. You know, you've been doing it in biotech, and I think that's an excellent field for us to be developing in Armenia, because it's a part of the future of the world. If there, I mean, you know, I want to give you a tremendous amount of credit, because your efforts have literally been influential in changing the course of the world. Where would we be now if it wasn't for biomedical innovation and technology? I mean, I don't think anyone can really predict that, but I don't think we would be in a good place. Let's put it that way. So, you know, having the foresight to think about where are the areas and what are the seeds that we need to plant, to water and nurture, despite what happens with, you know, kind of the conflicts with hostile nations around Armenia. It's like, you know, they're not mutually exclusive thoughts. I think that's what I'm trying to get across, is that we have to be doing this simultaneously. At the same time, we cannot allow Armenia to be subjugated under, you know, kleptocracies and authoritarian powers. You know, the world right now is really inappropriately focused on what's been happening to Ukraine. But that doesn't mean, and you know, the United States, for example, should be selective in its advocacy for one group of invaded people and completely disregard another group of invaded people, and you know, and make it seem like, well, we only care about human rights and violations of human rights here because it affects us, but we don't really mind if there's human rights violators invading Armenia, because nobody, or Artsakh, because we don't really even know what that is, and Armenia doesn't have oil. So, and at the end of the day, I think that's what a lot of this comes down to. We can't establish an oil, nor should we, an oil business in Armenia, but what else can we be doing to ensure the future of Armenia and Armenians, because I include Artsakh in that too.
Changing gears to talk about one of the hats you wear, which is filmmaking. You've helped produce several films: Francesco, about Pope Francis; The Promise; Intent to Destroy; and I'm Not Alone. On that vector, what's next?
Well, it's been an honor, honestly, you know, to be able to kind of convey and utilize a different part of my brain and convey thoughts that I have to do with social impact. Basically, every project I've worked on has had somehow a social impact-oriented theme. Obviously, we talked about the Armenian genocide, and with The Promise and Intent to Destroy. We have an important project coming out about the 44-day Artsakh War called Invisible Republic. And you know, I try to use the opportunity to share a story, particularly if it can be for a philanthropic purpose and somehow our human rights oriented purpose. I feel like it's an important way for us to communicate in this day and age. Particularly, I think the attention span that many people have has been dwindling for various scientific reasons and maybe some non-scientific reasons, unscientific reasons. But I think that using the visual medium and storytelling has been, you know, kind of something that's been important for me. So I mentioned, you know, Invisible Republic, and I have a few projects that are in development now. One thing that has been completely unrelated to social impact or human rights, but I did make a decision to try to incorporate Armenia into it, was our venture of Som TV, which is a streaming platform that is all about food and wine, and primarily wine, like sommelier. So we launched this platform in 2019. It was the only streaming platform dedicated to wine, and it's been taking off, so it's been a joy. But one of the things we wanted to do as part of this platform, we have original shows, films, and series. But you know, the origins of winemaking, of course, we know, go back to Armenia. Now, many people who are not Armenians will say, oh, you Armenians say everything is Armenia. First Christians, first winemaking, first shoe, you know, whatever. But it's true. So it goes, again, it's back to, you know, let's be kind of proud of our heritage and our history and try to share that story with the world. So my partners at Som TV and the filmmakers, Jason Wise, Christina Wise, and Jackson Myers, you know, they were really determined to go shoot in Armenia, and we did. So we shot this beautiful film, which is going to be called Cup of Salvation, and it's actually going to capture not just the origins of winemaking, but the history of wine and religion as well. I'm really excited about that. And I think it'll be actually a commercial for Armenian wine. So whoever owns Armenian wineries right now, I think they'll be very happy.
Well, that's definitely a part of the culture of the country that's flourishing. Right. It's really not just a product, but it's an expression. Yeah. Let me end with a question about a topic that some of the audience will have heard about, which is Benemerenti medal.
Oh yes.
This is a medal that's awarded by the Vatican, by Pope Francis, and you were the first Armenian to receive it. It's a very, very prestigious award, and it's somewhat a tribute to the role faith has played in your life. You talked about that a little bit early on, but how are you propelled by your faith, and how is your faith allowing you to do things that you might not have thought you could do?
Well, I mean, everything I feel like I do now particularly revolves around being a Christian, and I think about it. I'm certainly not perfect, and I definitely do not deserve this medal. When I was told I was being nominated for it, I kind of thought it was ridiculous. And, we know that people receive all sorts of honors over the years, and some of those people who receive honors aren't necessarily the best people. So I was very reluctant, and what really kind of convinced me was when I asked for a list of people who had received this medal, and I saw that it was basically people that were just decent people. They ran orphanages, or they worked in a church, or they had done all sorts of kind of real humanitarian stuff, not just kind of performative things that we see on television. And so that moved me. And then when representatives from the Vatican told me that I would be the first Armenian to receive it, then I felt a sense of pride, and I was blessed to be able to take my family with me, and so they were present, and I received the medal in the tomb of St. Peter, which is under the basilica. And it was very special and a memorable experience. So in Philippians, it says, I can do all things for him who strengthens me. So I think about that every day. And I tell people that I don't deserve it, but I will try to live up to it.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic, and I think you do deserve it. You've gotten such an acknowledgement at a relatively young age, which comes with a lot of burdens and responsibilities to live up to it. Right. They know, when people select people for such recognition, they also bestow a level of expectation of what you can do in the future, and maybe end on that futuristic note. I mean, it's probably what you're doing today is not what you thought you'd be doing 20 years ago. How do you think about what you might be able to do over the next 20 years?
Well, I appreciate you saying that, and for me, I definitely feel like we need to be looking forward. I think we can't live our lives, kind of being satisfied with any accomplishments or looking back. And I think it's also from a mental health kind of self-preservation standpoint, I try to focus a lot on being present, but also thinking about the future. And for me, thinking about the future means, what am I going to do, not just for my family, but for the people around me, my loved ones, but then from my community. Community being a broad term, meaning the people, in my geographic community as well as in the Armenian community. I think about collaborations and partnerships on a regular basis. I've been truly blessed to have met friends and mentors and partners and collaborators over my life. And I feel like that's continuing to develop over time, and I'm really honored to have a chance to talk to you and brainstorm possibilities of working on things together. I think the best is yet to come for us. And as I mentioned before, about this long book in Armenian history and this brief chapter that we're in right now, I want us all to try to do what we can to continue to write that book and make the world better. And I think the best is yet to come, and we're just getting started.
Super. Thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you. I'm honored.